Hi, I'm Lewis, also known as Scaffolds, and this is my game, Base Defender, that I made for the Ludum Dare 47 game jam. The theme for this jam was Stuck in a Loop, and Base Defender has you endlessly stuck rotating around a loop, shooting enemies and defending your base. It's available on Windows, Linux and Android, so if you're on any of those platforms, please give it a go. There's a link in the video description. I'm really pleased with how it turned out, so let's take a look into its development journey. Going into the jam, I felt underprepared. The jam theme was to be revealed on Friday the 2nd of October, but I still had the 23rd Project Tarum devlog to edit. Luckily the theme was revealed at 11 PM in the UK, so I had most of the evening to edit. When the theme was revealed as Stuck in a Loop, I tried to think of as many ideas as possible relating to it. I thought about how you could be physically stuck in a loop, or mentally stuck in a loop. Perhaps you're in a world that resets like Groundhog Day or Majora's Mask. Maybe you get pushed into doing certain tasks, a bit like the Stanley Parable. Another idea could be a racing game in which you physically race in a loop, or a maze that loops around itself. These ideas were nice, but when considering the 72-hour time frame and what I wanted from the jam, I decided I wanted to make the mechanics of the game fit the theme more than the content, which is when I came up with the idea for the game. The game should have you physically stuck in a loop. Enemies spawn which constantly have you moving around the loop in order to stop them. With the right tweaks, I figured this idea could get the player stuck in a loop. I thought this was a great idea, although I wasn't ready to commit to anything immediately. It was getting late and I had to finish the Project Tarum devlog, so I decided to sleep on it. Waking up on Saturday, and I was still keen on the game idea, so I decided to flesh it out. During this process, I used a few different games for inspiration. The first was a fun-orb game called Ace of Skies. This was a fighter pilot game which I distinctly remember had a turning motion that took you around the edge of your screen. Unfortunately, fun-orb is no longer available, but I did manage to find a few old videos of the game. Also on fun-orb was Star Cannon. I used to play this and it got me thinking about gameplay. If Star Cannon is a vertical shoot 'em up, then the game I'm to create will be a rotational shoot 'em up. Finally, I remember the YouTuber and game jam enthusiast Devlog created a rotational game in one of his recent videos. This was essentially a game of Pong that you play with yourself, but he added a lot of flair to it, which is something I wanted to replicate. With all these games in mind, I began drawing how I thought the gameplay would work, and prepared tasks to achieve this. The core design of the game is that you have to protect the base in the centre of the screen. Around the base is a track for the player turret to move around. Then enemies spawn around the edge of the screen, causing you to rotate to stop them. The first thing I worked on for this design was the player controls. I began by creating a loop track for the player to move on. I then added a turret on that track, which the player can adjust by pressing the up and down arrow keys. This motion was simple to achieve, with the equation to get an X and Y position on a circle with a given radius and angle. With this basic movement in place, I copied the projectile from Project Tarum into this game, which gave the player an awesome looking projectile to fire at enemies. I then looked into adding enemies. Luckily, enemies were simple to implement. They needed to head towards the middle of the screen and die when projectiles hit them. This behaviour was very similar to enemies in my last couple of games, so I took much of that code and reused it here. With enemies in place, the game needed an interesting spawning system to keep the player engaged and rotating around the loop. This was a core system, so I did some testing to work out how many enemies the player could deal with and decided on about 10. I then made a spawner that spawns enemies behind the player, causing the player to rotate around the loop in order to get a shot on them. The last step with the spawning system was to add some variance. I made the spawn position move slower than the player and added a sine wave to the enemy spawn pattern. This means there's a constant threat of enemies causing you to keep adjusting your position, making you rotate around the loop. Finally, I added a base, which takes damage from enemies, so you must protect it. At this point, the bare basics of the game were in place. I tested the game and even drafted my flatmate to have a go. We were in agreement that the core concept was pretty fun, although tricky. As such, I made some tweaks to things like player fire rate and enemy size to see if that was easier, as well as thinking of new features that could improve the game. The first of these new features was a health bar. This is something people have suggested I add to my past games, but I've never gotten round to, so I was happy to finally create one. I then added a basic healing effect to the base, so if you're doing particularly well you're rewarded. This happens at a rate of 1% per second. The next feature I added was collision between the player and the enemies, because it was kind of odd when enemies phased through the player. Although as soon as I added that I removed it, because it turned the player into a wrecking ball, no longer having to rotate around the loop to kill enemies. Instead they can just stay in one position, easily smacking into enemies that spawn behind them. The last feature I added was a power-up system. Killing enemies increases your kill streak, but enemies hitting your base resets it. On your first kill streak of 5, or every 10 kills after, a power-up spawns and heads towards the player. This power-up improves your weapon by increasing its fire speed and projectile size. This system turned out to be such a great way to reward the player. I consider it a crucial part of the gameplay and a very satisfying one at that. By this point the core gameplay loop was complete. I was pleased with this, so to finish the day I just created a short GIF of the gameplay to show off my progress and I went to bed. Waking up on Sunday I was keen to keep working on the game. Since I had gotten all the gameplay working on Saturday, I wanted to upgrade the look and feel of the game, so it felt like a polished game. I began by creating art assets for everything, but I struggled to come up with what kind of art to create. All I really knew was I wanted to create well-defined sprites, avoiding the standard tiny pixel art that many indie devs go for. During this process, I had various ideas run through my head about how I could create art that tells a story, such as maybe drones delivering goods to a prisoner, or fending off spaceships, but none of that felt right. At this point I saw a video by PatchQuest, and I really liked the images he had created for his power-ups. The shapes were simple, but well defined, and they had a solid colour outline. I figured I could easily create similar art, and it would look fantastic. So the approach I took for this art was to create a black outline for the shape of the object. I would then add decoration to the centre of the object, so in this case I added a star to the power-up sprite, and with this done I added a white background to the shape and a white drop shadow around the entire sprite. With this art style well defined, I then created the loop, the player turret, the enemy, and the base, which I tried adding some animation to and a shield to indicate you must protect it. I then changed the background colour to be black and adjusted projectiles to include a white streak. This all came together really well and I was super pleased with how it looked. A huge benefit of making the sprites like this was their white colour. Later on in the game engine I could then recolour them anything I wanted. For example, the enemies turn red, and the player track goes through a whole range of colours when you pick up a power-up. With the art style in place, I added a menu to give the player a break between play sessions. This menu took the same art style as the game, with all text using the Impact font. The great bit about this menu was that it could easily explain the game and its controls. I think this turned out really well and only needed a few minor adjustments later on. After that the game needed sound. Apart from knowing a few guitar tabs, I'm really not a sound guy, so I went to opengameart.org to look for sounds. I began by looking for laser sounds for the projectile in the game. Luckily I found a pack of 22 sci-fi sounds by Rubber Duck. I thought these were all fantastic, so I went through the whole pack and chose sounds that I thought fit the game best. I then needed some music to add to the atmosphere. Searching for looping space music, I stumbled upon a track called Bit Space by Beam Theory, which was inspired by FTL. Listening to the track I knew it was the perfect music for the game. It's relaxing, but also has a great beat to it that keeps you wanting more, complementing the looping gameplay really well. I then took all these sounds and put them in game, and when I played it I was really amazed with how it felt. The sounds and the music gel really well with the gameplay, and I'm so thankful for opengameart.org for being there and their amazing creators. At this point, the core of the game was finished, but I still had time to work on the game, so I decided to start adding as much polish to the game as possible. The most notable of which was the particle effects I added. The first effects were for enemies. When you kill an enemy, a small red effect spawns, and when an enemy hits the base, a small grey effect spawns. I think these feel pretty punchy, and I definitely want to remember this effect in the future. I then added a multiplier effect for when you hit a kill streak upgrade. These spawn when you hit a multiplier and let the player know what tier they're at. These are probably the most satisfying and my favourite effect in the game. Finally, I wanted to give the game something going on in the background, since the black was just a bit dull. So I experimented with a particle system to do this. I think this turned out great, and all of these effects really add to the game mood. At this point I was done. The game felt great and I didn't know what else to try and add. As such, I decided to see if I could port it onto mobile. I added virtual buttons for rotating and firing, as well as updated icons on the menu to suit mobile. This worked out well, so I created Windows, Linux and Android builds of the project and uploaded them to the Jam website. Once I had done that, I went to bed happy with the game. On Monday I had work, but I decided to share the game with some colleagues. One of which is an avid mobile gamer, and he tried it out on his phone. He seemed to like it but had some problems. He gave me some really useful feedback on the mobile controls that I just had to fix. As such, on my lunch break I made a couple of tweaks. The first tweak was for the virtual buttons. I had no indicator where the boundary was or which way it would rotate, so I created an image to cover the virtual button area and added a rotational image to let you know which way it would rotate. With these in place, I could remove the heavy-handed instruction images from the main menu. The second tweak was, instead of having the entire screen begin the game, just make the play image do so. So I moved the hitbox and coloured the image to indicate to the player to tap the button to start. These tweaks were really crucial to the mobile port, and I'm really thankful for the feedback I got on this. Participating in this jam was awesome. It was my first Ludum Dare and I think I created a really fun arcade game. Please check the game out, the link will be in the video description. Voting for Ludum Dare finishes on the 28th of October, so please leave the game a review if you can. I just need 20 to finish with a proper score. I hope you've enjoyed watching this devlog for Base Defender. Leave the video a like to let me know you did, and comment to give me any feedback. Subscribe for more game development content. I know I'll be looking for other game jams in the near future, and I have a weekly devlog video for my tower defense game, Project Powerup. Thank you and goodbye.